October 14th, 1943. The English dawn breaks grey over Ridgewell Airfield, where men prepare to cross a sky already thick with fate. Bombers line the runway like coffins with wings, engines coughing into the cold. Inside the briefing room, silence follows the word Schweinfurt, the name that carries the weight of previous losses, of empty bunks and unanswered letters. First Lieutenant Robert McCoy traces the route on his map with a steady finger, though his hand knows what his mind will not say. Not all paths return. Around him, crews adjust their harnesses, check their photographs one last time, murmur prayers into clasped hands. The intelligence officer speaks of flak corridors and fighter concentrations, but his voice fades beneath the louder truth humming through every man present. Somewhere over Germany, in fire or cold or sudden darkness, some of them will simply vanish. Their final moments, known only to the air itself and to history, which keeps its secrets longer than any man can wait. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The briefing room at Ridgewell held the particular silence of men confronting arithmetic. Colonel Nazaro stood before the wall map, pointer in hand, the route traced in red grease pencil from England to central Germany and back. The distance seemed both infinite and achingly short. "Target, Schweinfurt," he said. "Ball-bearing factories? You know what that means?" The crews knew. 6 weeks prior, the first Schweinfurt raid had cost 60 aircraft. The numbers lived in the spaces between words, in the way men shifted in their seats, in the hollow sound of pencils scratching coordinates onto knee pads. McCoy sat in the third row, flight jacket zipped against the morning chill that penetrated Evilly's walls. Around him, the other pilots of the 380th Bombardment Group absorbed the intelligence briefing with varying degrees of resignation. Weather marginal, fighter escort partial, only to the Belgian border. Expected opposition severe. The navigator beside him, Lieutenant Keogh, marked the turning points with mechanical precision. His hands did not shake, though McCoy noticed he gripped the pencil harder than necessary. "Flak concentrations here, here and here," the intelligence officer continued, tapping the map. "Luftwaffe has reinforced the corridor since Regensburg. Expect FW-190S and ME-199S in force." Someone coughed. Outside, the first engines were already turning over, their deep thunder vibrating through the floor. McCoy studied the map, calculating fuel consumption, wind drift, the geometry of survival. The mathematics were unforgiving. At 25,000 feet, in formation, at 170 miles per hour, a man could measure his life in miles per gallon and seconds of exposure. "Take off. At 0700, Nazaro said. "Assembly over, Splasher 6. Any questions?" There were none. Questions implied answers, and on mornings like this, there were only procedures. McCoy rose with the others, tucking his notes into his flight suit. The room emptied in orderly fashion, men filing toward the trucks that would carry them to their aircraft. No one hurried. The war had taught them that time moved at its own pace, indifferent to human urgency. The channel spread below them like hammered pewter, its surface reflecting the weak morning sun. McCoy's B-17, designated LGN, held position in the high squadron, its 4 Wright Cyclone engines beating steadily against the thin October air. "Navigator to pilot, on course, on time." Keogh's voice crackled through the interphone, steady as a metronome. McCoy checked his instruments. Airspeed, 175. Altitude, 12,000 and climbing. Oil pressure, cylinder head temperature, fuel flow, all within parameters. The gauges told him what he needed to know, though they could not tell him what mattered. Through the cockpit glass, the formations stretched ahead and to both sides. Bombers stacked in their combat boxes like a geometry lesson written in aluminium and rivets. 60 aircraft from the 383rd alone. More from other groups joining at the assembly point. Together they would form a stream 40 miles long, a river of metal flowing toward Germany. Sergeant Harper, his co-pilot, scanned the sky with the perpetual vigilance of a man who understood that death arrived without announcement. "Tight formation," he observed. "Good visibility. For now," McCoy replied. The British coast fell away beneath them. Over the radio, group commanders verified positions, adjusted intervals, confirmed radio discipline. The chatter was professional, minimal. Lord Sergeant Harper, to the coast, each transmission represented a small expenditure of concentration, and concentration was currency they would need later. In the nose, the bombardier was already computing wind drift, though they were hours from the target. Below, the navigator marked their position on his chart with the same methodical care he would maintain until bombs away, or until the aircraft ceased to fly, whichever came first. The formation climbed steadily into the cold upper air, where oxygen became precious and frostbite waited in every draft. McCoy adjusted his throat microphone, flexed his fingers inside his heated gloves. The leather flight jacket, the wool layers beneath, the fur collar, none of it truly defeated the cold at altitude. A man simply endured. Ahead lay Belgium, then Germany. Behind lay everything else. The flak began over Aachen, black flowers blooming in the sky with geometric precision. The German gunners had had 3 years to perfect their craft, and it showed in the tight patterns that bracketed the formation. Flak, 10 o'clock. "Level!" the top turret gunner called. McCoy held course. Evasive action was a luxury reserved for single aircraft. Formations moved like freight trains, massive and committed to their rails. The bomber shuddered as concussion waves from nearby bursts hammered against the fuselage. Shrapnel rattled against aluminum like hail on a tin roof. "Fighter, 2 o'clock high." The tail gunner's voice carried no emotion, only information. McCoy saw them then, small dark crosses against the pale sky, climbing toward the formation's altitude. Me-109s, perhaps 8 or 10, taking their positions for the attack run. They came from the sun, as fighters always had and always would, physics and tactics coinciding in the oldest lesson of aerial warfare. The formation tightened. Closing the gaps meant bringing each bomber within protective range of its neighbor's guns, creating overlapping fields of fire. It also meant flying so close that wing tips seemed to touch, that the prop wash from adjacent aircraft buffeted each plane continuously. "Oxygen check," McCoy ordered. One by one, the crew members reported their status. At 24,000 feet, a failed oxygen system meant unconsciousness within minutes. The cold at this altitude froze moisture in the regulators, turned metal brittle, made every system a potential failure point. The fighters came through in pairs, diving from above, cannon fire tracing bright lines through the formation. Tracers arced past McCoy's windscreen. The B-17 bucked as the gunners returned fire, spent casings clattering onto the deck, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and hydraulic fluid. Then the fighters were through, climbing away for another pass. The formation flew on. Below, Belgium slid past, its fields and towns reduced to abstractions by altitude and purpose. Entering German airspace, Hugh announced, his voice carrying the weight of a border crossed that could not be uncrossed. Schweinfurt appeared through the haze exactly where the maps promised it would be, a sprawl of industrial buildings centered around the Kugelfischer ball-bearing works. The precision of its location seemed almost an insult, as if the world operated on schedules and coordinates, while men died in fire and concussion. "IP in 2 minutes, the bombardier announced. The initial point, where the bomb run began and all evasive action ceased. From there to target, the aircraft would fly straight and level, a trajectory as predictable as mathematics, as vulnerable as any living thing could be. The flak intensified. The German gunners below knew the geometry as well as the bombardiers above. They knew the altitude, the speed, the iron laws that governed heavy bombers on their final approach. The sky filled with bursts, a garden of black smoke and steel fragments, each explosion capable of gutting an aircraft, or merely passing harmlessly to the side. A lottery conducted in 3 dimensions. Bomb bay doors open. McCoy felt the drag as the doors swung down, felt the aircraft slow slightly against the additional resistance. The bomber became an even larger target, its belly exposed. Around him, the formation maintained its positions with a discipline that transcended courage and approached ritual. The bombardier hunched over his Norden sight, making minute adjustments. The crosshairs had to align precisely. The release point calculated to account for altitude, airspeed, wind, the ballistic arc that would carry 5,000 pounds of high explosive from 6 miles up to the factory floor below. Steady. Steady. McCoy held the controls with both hands, making infinitesimal corrections. The bomber shuddered continuously from nearby flak bursts. Somewhere to his left, an aircraft took a direct hit, its wing folding upward before the entire plane tumbled from formation, spilling from hatches like seeds from a broken pod. "Bombs away!" The aircraft lurched upward, suddenly lighter. Through breaks in the smoke below, fires could be seen blooming among the factory buildings. The camera in the belly recorded the impacts, mechanical witness to what men had come so far to accomplish. Then McCoy felt the hit. The explosion came from below and to the right, a hammer blow that slammed through the wing root and sent the aircraft yawing hard to starboard. Warning lights blazed across the instrument panel. The No. 3 engine was streaming fire, and fuel gauges unwound like clocks running backward. "Fire in 3, Harper reported, already reaching for the engine shutdown procedures. McCoy wrestled the controls. The B-17 wanted to spiral, wanted to drop from formation into the flak-filled air below. He pushed the opposite rudder hard, trimming against the asymmetric thrust, fighting the physics of damaged flight. "Can we make it home?" Harper asked. McCoy scanned the instruments. Fuel bleeding from ruptured tanks, oil pressure falling on the damaged engine, altitude bleeding away despite full power on the remaining 3 engines. The arithmetic was pitiless. "Negative," he said. "We're going down." The crew needed no elaboration. In the tail, the gunner destroyed his gun sight, standard procedure to prevent capture of the technology. The navigator began tearing up his classified maps. The radio operator destroyed his code sheets. Each man performed his assigned tasks with the automatic precision of training, though training had never quite prepared them for this moment. "Prepare to bail out," McCoy ordered. The formation was already past, continuing toward the rally point, where those who could would reassemble for the journey home. LGN fell behind, descending through the layers of war toward the German countryside below. "Bombardier out," the navigator's voice came through the interphone, reporting who had already jumped from the forward hatch. "Waist gunners out. Radio operator out." One by one they went, parachutes blossoming white against the dark earth. Harper remained at his station, helping McCoy maintain enough control for the others to escape. When only they remained, Harper looked at his pilot. "Your turn," McCoy said. "What about you?" "Somebody has to hold her steady." Harper hesitated, understanding crystallizing in his eyes. Then he gripped McCoy's shoulder once, hard, and dropped through the forward hatch. His chute opened. McCoy counted 5 canopies, then lost sight of them as the bomber fell into a steeper descent. The forest was very close now, very green. The explosion echoed across the village of Giesel like thunder torn from a clear sky. Farmers in their fields looked up to see black smoke rising from the forests south of town. The smoke column climbed straight and dark, a pillar marking where something had ended. Within the hour, a Wehrmacht patrol arrived from the garrison at Fulda. Sergeant Müller led 6 men into the woods, following the smoke to its source. What they found had ceased to be an aircraft in any recognizable sense. Metal twisted into abstract shapes, still hot to the touch. Trees sheared at their trunks, earth scorched black in a rough circle. "American bomber," Müller observed, studying a fragment of wing that bore a faded star insignia. "Heavy." The soldiers searched methodically, moving in a line through the debris field. They found a boot, a glove, pieces of equipment too damaged to identify. The forest floor was littered with aluminium fragments that caught the afternoon light like scattered mirrors. "Here," one soldier called. Müller approached the spot where the tail section had come to rest, remarkably intact despite the violence that had separated it from the rest of the aircraft. Stenciled on the vertical stabilizer, still legible. LGN. They searched through the remainder of the afternoon as shadows lengthened between the trees. No bodies. The impact and subsequent fire had left few things untouched, and those things offered no identification beyond nationality. An oxygen regulator, a length of interphone wire, a control yoke bent at an impossible angle. As dusk fell, Müller posted a guard and returned to Fulda to file his report. The report was brief, factual. American bomber down, crew apparently parachuted prior to crash, wreckage too damaged for recovery, no military value. The report was filed, copied, forwarded through channels. It moved from Fulda to Frankfurt to Berlin, each office stamping and initialing before passing it onward. By December, it resided in a filing cabinet in the Reich Air Ministry, one report among thousands. In the forest, autumn rain began to cover what war had uncovered, leaves drifting down to soften the sharp edges of wreckage. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered by a Western Union messenger who had performed this duty too many times to meet Mrs. McCoy's eyes directly. She signed for it with a hand that had already begun to tremble before she opened the envelope. "The Secretary of War deceased me to express his deep regret that your son, First Lieutenant Robert WMCOY, has been reported missing in action. Since 14th October, Over Germany further detail or other information are received, you will be promptly notified. She read it 3 times before the words penetrated beyond their surface, meaning into the cavity where certainty lived. Missing. Not killed, missing. The distinction seemed simultaneously vast and infinitesimal. Her husband stood behind her, reading over her. She shuddered. Neither spoke. Language seemed insufficient for the geography they now inhabited, that space between knowledge and hope, between the known and the forever unknown. By afternoon, neighbours had heard. They arrived with covered dishes and quiet condolences, filling the house with the particular silence of those who know that nothing they say will matter. Mrs. Amorati McCoy received them with the formal courtesy that had been bred into her, thanking them for coming, assuring them she was fine, she was managing, she had faith. The evening newspaper ran a short article on page 4, Local Airman Missing Over Germany. It gave McCoy's age, his rank, his service record. It mentioned that he had been a mechanic before the war, that he had learned to fly in training. It did not mention the way he had always checked his work twice, or how he had written home every Sunday without ale, or the particular quality of his rare smile. Mrs. McCoy folded his uniform and placed it on his bed. The wool still held the faint smell of him, though that too would fade. She touched the silver wings on the tunic, tracing their shape with her finger. Then she closed the door and went downstairs to wait for mail that might come, for information that might arrive, for certainty that might never find its way home. The American Military Cemetery at Cambridge, England, spread across 30 acres of ground that had once been farmland. Row upon row of white crosses marked the graves of airmen who had fallen during the war, their names and ranks carved into marble that would outlast memory. In a temporary building at the cemetery's edge, Major Richard Stanton of the American Graves Registration Service reviewed the files of those still missing. The year was 1946. The war 14 months past, yet his office remained full of unanswered questions, rendered in paper and typewriter ribbon. McCoy's file lay in the stack designated Presumed Dead, Body Unrecovered. Stanton opened it and reviewed its contents. Mission report from the 383rd Bombardment Group. Witness statements from surviving crew members, obtained from POW camps after liberation. German documentation, what little existed, obtained through military government channels. The picture assembled itself across the documents. Aircraft hit by flak. Crew bailed out. 5 men captured. Pilot remained with aircraft. Crash site reported near Fulda. Subsequent search mission, unable to locate exact site due to Soviet occupation of the region. Stanton made notes in the margin of his summary sheet. Without physical remains, without direct German confirmation of death, the case could not be closed as killed in action. Yet neither could McCoy be listed as prisoner, or pink. Irpu, Ninoye, camps had been liberated, all prisoners accounted for. The compromise was bureaucratic necessity rendered as euphemism. Missing in action, presumed dead. Stanton signed the form, added it to the file, placed the file in the cabinet designated for cases pending further information. The cabinet was nearly full. Around him, other officers performed similar rituals with similar files, each folder representing a family somewhere receiving letters that began, "The department regrets to inform you." Through the window, Stanton could see the cemetery grounds, where gardeners maintained the grass around the graves with meticulous care. But for some there would be no grave to tend. Their names would be inscribed on the tablets of the missing, present only as letters carved in stone. McCoy's name would be among them. Spring came late to central Germany in 1958. Werner Hoffmann worked his plough through soil still heavy with winter rain, turning the earth in preparation for planting. The field had been fallow during the war years, and even now, 13 years after surrender, the land still occasionally yielded up evidence of that period. Shell casings, belt buckles, fragments of things better left unidentified. The plough caught on something solid. Hoffmann stopped his tractor, climbed down, and began digging with a spade. What emerged was not stone, but metal, twisted and corroded by years underground. He uncovered more, a curved sheet of aluminium, a piece of strut, something that might have been part of a control mechanism. He knew what it was. The older villagers spoke sometimes of the bomber that had come down in the forest during the war, the explosions that had rattled windows in Hünfeld. The forest had long since reclaimed the crash site, but apparently pieces had been scattered farther than anyone had realized, Hoffmann reported his find to the police, who contacted the American liaison office in Frankfurt. Within a week, an investigator arrived to examine the wreckage. He photographed the fragments, measured their positions, collected samples in canvas bags. One piece drew particular attention, a section of fuselage skin bearing a partial serial number. The investigator cleaned it carefully, photographed it from multiple angles. The number began with 42-3. The prefix assigned to aircraft manufactured in 1942 and 1943. "Can you determine which plane?" Hoffmann asked. The investigator shook his head. "The serial is incomplete. Without more digits, we cannot narrow it to a specific aircraft. Many B-17s were lost in this region." He continued his examination through the afternoon, sifting through soil, cataloguing fragments. The work was methodical, almost archaeological. In one corner of the field, he found what appeared to be a belt buckle, so corroded that its shape barely suggested its original function. He cleaned it carefully. On its surface, barely visible, letters had been engraved. R.W.M. The investigator placed it carefully in an evidence bag. The American Graves Commission maintained offices in Frankfurt, in a building that had survived the bombing through fortune rather than design. Lieutenant Colonel James Bradford received the evidence bags from Hünfeld with the weariness of a man who had spent too many years accounting for the dead. He spread the contents across his desk. Aluminium fragments, a buckle, photographs of the crash site, the serial number partial, the buckle engraved but not official issue, the type of personal item a man might have purchased himself, might have worn instead of the standard military issue. Bradford cross-referenced the serial number prefix against production records. The 42-3 designation narrowed the field somewhat. Aircraft built between January and June 1943, delivered to England for the 8th Air Force. Approximately 200 aircraft fitting that description had been lost over Germany. He examined the buckle under magnification. The letters were faint but distinct. RW1, 3 initials suggesting a middle name or initial. He consulted the casualty lists for the region for the time period when such an aircraft would have been operational. Multiple possibilities emerged. Reynolds, William M. Richardson, Walter M. McCoy, Robert W. Bradford pulled the McCoy file, already familiar to him from previous reviews. The mission date matched the probable loss date for an aircraft in that region. The circumstances matched. Bailout, pilot remaining with aircraft, crash site in the Fulda area. Yet, without more evidence, positive identification remained impossible. DNA analysis did not exist. Dental records required teeth. Dog tags, if they had existed, had not been recovered. The buckle, personal rather than military issue, carried no service number. Bradford wrote his report carefully. Strong probability that remains belong to First Lieutenant Robert W. McCoy, 380 Search Bombardment Group, based on circumstantial evidence and geographic correlation. However, without definitive identification markers, case remains classified as unresolved. He filed the report, updated McCoy's status to probable location of loss identified, and forwarded a copy to the Department of Defense in Washington. The buckle remained in the evidence locker, labeled and catalogued, waiting for a certainty that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. The letter arrived at the Pentagon in March 1965, handwritten on drugstore stationery, the script precise, despite the slight tremor visible in certain letters. Mrs. Ellen McCoy had been writing such letters for 22 years. "Dear Sir," it began, "I am writing once again to inquire about the status of my son, First Lieutenant Robert W. McCoy, who was reported missing in action on October 14, 1943, over Germany." The letter detailed what she knew, what she had been told, what remained unknown. It referenced the wreckage found in Hünfeld, the buckle with his initials, the probability assessment from Frankfurt. It asked, with persistent courtesy, whether any additional information had been obtained. "I understand that many families are in similar circumstances," she wrote. "I do not ask for special consideration. I ask only that my son not be forgotten, that the search continue, that if evidence exists it be found and recognized." The letter was forwarded to the Military Personnel Records Center, where specialist Andrea Morrison read it with the particular attention reserved for correspondence from families of the missing. Morrison had joined the army after her own brother had been killed in Korea. She understood the need for answers, even painful ones. She pulled McCoy's file, now several inches, thick with accumulated documentation. Mission reports, witness statements, German records, the 1959 investigation notes, the buckle photographs. Everything pointed toward the Hünfeld crash site. Everything suggested McCoy had died on impact. yet the case remained officially unresolved. Morrison drafted a response. She confirmed that the investigation remained active, that all available evidence had been reviewed, that the department continued to seek definitive identification. She thanked Mrs. McCoy for her patience and persistence. What she did not write, what the regulations prevented her from writing, was that Vietnam had become the consuming focus, that resources for World War II cases had dwindled, that 22 years was perhaps too long to expect certainty. She signed the letter, forwarded a copy to the file, and moved to the next case. Outside her window, Arlington Cemetery stretched away into the spring afternoon. Father Matthias Schwartz had served the parish of Heinrichsruh for 38 years. Long enough to have buried members of 3 generations. His office occupied a small room behind the church, its walls lined with ledgers recording births, marriages, deaths, the arithmetic of a community rendered in dates and names. In 1971, a researcher from the German Red Cross arrived, seeking records of wartime burials. The researcher, a woman named Petra Klein, explained that families in America continued to search for relatives lost during the war. Any documentation might help bring closure. Father Schwartz understood. He had performed such burials himself. Soldiers found in fields, airmen pulled from wreckage, refugees who had died on the roads. The war had been profligate with death. He opened the ledger for 1943. Klein read over his shoulder, her finger tracing down the columns. October entries. A farmer killed in an Allied air raid, a child dead from disease, an elderly woman of natural causes. Then, near the bottom of the page, unknown American airman, 14 October 1943, approximate age 2030, recovered from aircraft crash south of village, buried in parish cemetery, southwest quadrant. Grave marked with wooden cross, inscription, Ein amerikanischer Flieger. Klein photographed the entry with careful attention to detail. "Do you remember this?" she asked. Father Schwartz considered. He had been younger then, newly assigned to the parish. "I remember the burial," he said slowly. "The man was badly burned. Identification was impossible. The Wehrmacht reported him as American based on uniform remnants. We buried him with what dignity we could manage. The grave still exists. The wooden cross has been replaced several times, but yes, the location is recorded." Klein made notes, asked questions about what documents the Wehrmacht might have filed, whether photographs existed. Father Schwartz answered what he could, but much had been lost in the chaos of defeat and occupation. As Klein prepared to leave, the priest added, "We did not consider him an enemy, only a young man far from home." The International Committee of the Red Cross maintained archives in Geneva that spanned wars and continents, filing cabinets holding the traces of millions of displaced persons, prisoners of war and missing soldiers. In 1974, as part of an ongoing effort to resolve outstanding World War II cases, the ICRC began systematic review of its German files. The work fell to Henri Rousseau, a Belgian archivist who had spent the last decade of his career attempting to reunite fractured documentation. He worked methodically, cross-referencing German military records with Allied casualty reports, looking for patterns that might resolve cases lost in the administrative chaos of the war's end. The McCoy case appeared first in a Wehrmacht report filed from Fulda in October 1943, noting the recovery of an American airman from a crash site. The report gave approximate coordinates, date and condition of remains. Separately, Rousseau found a German Red Cross tracing card from 1946, created during the post-war effort to account for all war dead. The card referenced a burial in Heinrichsruh on October 14, 1943. Rousseau laid the documents side by side, same date, same general location, same nationality. He pulled the American casualty files for that date, scanning the list of missing aircraft. 5 bombers from the 387th Bombardment Group had been lost. Of these, 4 crews had been fully accounted for through POW records. The 5th was McCoy's. He plotted the coordinates on a military map. The crash site, reported by the Wehrmacht's patrol, fell within 2 kilometers of Heinrichsruh. The timeline matched. Morning mission, afternoon crash, same-day burial. Rousseau prepared a detailed report of his findings and forwarded it to both the American and German governments. In his covering letter, he noted, "While physical evidence remains incomplete, documentary evidence strongly suggests that the unknown American airman buried in Heinrichsruh is First Lieutenant Robert W. McCoy, 380 searched, bombardment group, United States Army Air Forces. The report was received, acknowledged, filed. 3 decades after the mission, the pieces were finally aligning. Mrs. McCoy sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had received the telegram 32 years earlier, and composed her final letter to the Department of Defense. Her hands had grown stiff with age, and the writing came slower than it once had. But the words remained clear. "I am 79 years old," she wrote. "I do not expect to receive my son home. I understand that the circumstances of war make recovery impossible. But I ask one thing, that the evidence be examined with care, that the conclusion be reached with certainty, and that he be named." She detailed what she had learned through her own persistence. The crash site in Hünfeld, the buckle with his initials, the ICRC report from Geneva. She assembled the fragments as she had for 3 decades, laying them out in precise order, building toward a conclusion that seemed both obvious and frustratingly out of reach. "He was never afraid to fly," she wrote, "only to be forgotten." She sealed the letter, addressed it with the same careful precision she had learned from a lifetime of correspondence, and mailed it from the post office in town. The postal clerk, who had known her for years, accepted it without comment. 6 weeks later, a reply arrived on Department of Defense letterhead. Chief of the Personnel Affairs Division acknowledged receipt of her letter and the accumulated evidence. He confirmed that the case had been reviewed in light of the ICRC findings. "While the preponderance of circumstantial evidence supports the conclusion that your son was killed in action on October 14, 1943, and that his remains may be those interred at Heinrichsruh cemetery, we are unable to make a definitive identification without physical verification," the letter stated. "Therefore, Lieutenant McCoy's status remains missing in action. We recognize this is not the closure you seek, but we are bound by evidentiary standards necessary for official reclassification." The letter concluded with an assurance that should additional evidence emerge, the case would be immediately reopened. It thanked her for her patience and her son's service. Mrs. McCoy folded the letter and placed it in the box where she kept all the others. Dozens of them now, spanning 3 decades, a paper trail of questions asked and partially answered. She did not weep. Tears required surprise, and nothing in the letter surprised her. She had long since accepted that she would not receive certainty, only accumulation. The evidence would mount like snow against a fence, but the final proof would remain always just beyond reach. Her son had vanished into the air over Germany, and the air kept its secrets. Still, she had done what a mother could do. She had insisted he be remembered. She had refused to let silence become permanence. That evening, she placed his photograph on the mantel, as she did every October 14th, and lit a candle beside it. The diplomatic correspondence between Bonn and Washington moved with the stately pace of official channels, each letter carefully worded, each assertion documented with reference numbers. In 1976, the German Red Cross prepared a comprehensive response to American inquiries regarding wartime burial sites. The report arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Bonn as part of a larger initiative to resolve outstanding cases before they passed beyond living memory. Ambassador Richard Peterson assigned the review to his military attaché, Colonel Marcus Fremont, who had experience with such matters from his previous posting in Berlin. Fremont examined the German documentation methodically. The Wehrmacht patrol report from 1943, the parish burial register, the Red Cross tracing card, the witness statements from villagers who remembered the burial, everything aligned with precision that seemed almost suspicious in its completeness. He visited Heinrichsruh himself, driving through the Hessian countryside on a grey November morning. Father Schwarz, now elderly, met him at the church and led him to the cemetery. The wooden cross had been replaced multiple times over the years, but its location had never changed. "We have maintained the grave," Father Schwab said. "Even during difficult years when resources were scarce, we maintained it." Fremont stood before the simple cross. The inscription remained as it had been. Ein amerikanischer Flieger, a German phrase meaning an American airman. Nothing more specific had ever been possible. "Your records indicate October 14, 1943, Fremont said. "Correct. The same day the villagers heard the crash. "And the condition of the remains?" Father Schwarz hesitated. "The war was not kind to anyone, Colonel. The man had died in fire. We did what dignity required." Fremont thanked him and returned to Bonn. His report to Washington was measured in tone but clear in conclusion. "The German documentation is consistent, credible, and corroborated by multiple independent sources. While physical identification remains impossible without exhumation and forensic analysis, the circumstantial case for the Heinrichsruh burial being First Robert W. McCoy is compelling. The report was filed with the others, another piece in the mosaic of evidence that surrounded the case like a frame around an empty space. The 381st Bombardment Group held its reunion in Cambridge, England in 1978, 35 years after the missions that had defined their youth. Fewer men attended each year, age and distance taking their toll. They gathered at the American cemetery, walking among the white crosses, finding names they remembered. Thomas Harper, now 63 years old, stood before the tablets of the missing. His finger traced down the alphabetical list until it found McCoy, Robert W. 1C, Army, Air Forces. The letters were carved deep, designed to last centuries. Other survivors joined him. They stood in silence, remembering that October day, the flak, the fire, the moment when their aircraft had broken from formation. Harper had told the story before, but he told it again now, his voice steady despite the weight of years. He held the controls, Harper said. We all got out because he held the controls. The plane was going down hard, spinning, but he kept it stable enough for us to jump. When I went through the hatch, I looked back. He was still there, both hands on the yoke, fighting to keep her level. You think he could have made it out? Someone asked. Harper shook his head. Not at that altitude, not with the spin she was in. He knew. He stayed anyway. The group stood quiet. The October wind moved through the cemetery trees, carrying the first leaves of autumn. Around them, other reunions were taking place, other stories being told, other silences being honoured. A younger man approached, introducing himself as James Bradford, now retired from the Graves Commission. He had heard they were here and wanted to share what he knew about the Hünfeld investigation. He described the evidence carefully. The crash site, the buckle, the burial in Heinrichsruh, the documentary evidence from Geneva and Bonn. We can't prove it definitively, he concluded, but I believe we know where he is. Harper listened, then looked back at the carved name. At least he's somewhere, he said. At least he didn't just disappear into nothing. They held a small ceremony, informal but deliberate, placing flowers beneath McCoy's name on the tablets of the missing. The military archives in Kassel occupied a converted warehouse, its metal shelves stretching back into shadows that seemed to have no end. Dr. Klaus Ritter had requested access months earlier, explaining his research into undocumented crash sites. The archivist, satisfied with his credentials, granted him 3 days. Ritter worked systematically, beginning with Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs from October 1943. The Germans had been meticulous, photographing bomb damage, crash sites, anything that might provide intelligence value. Most photographs had been catalogued, but some had been misfiled during the chaos of 1945, placed in folders marked only by date rather than content. On his second day, Ritter found a folder labelled simply October 1943, Fulda Sector. Inside were perhaps 30 photographs, most showing damaged buildings or roads. Near the bottom of the stack he found 3 photographs of an aircraft crash site. The first showed an impact crater in a forest, trees splintered outward from a central point. The second showed scattered wreckage, recognizable as a large aircraft but too fragmented for immediate identification. The third showed a tail section, remarkably intact, lying separate from the main debris field. Ritter held the photograph under the desk lamp. On the tail's vertical stabilizer, clearly visible despite the photograph's age, were letters LGN. He sat back, understanding immediately what he had found. American bombers carried unit designations on their tails. This sequence, LGN, would correspond to a specific aircraft, a specific crew, a specific mission. He photographed the original photographs with his own camera, careful to capture every detail. Then he began searching the surrounding files for any associated documentation. He found a brief Luftwaffe report, noting the crash location's coordinates, dated October 14, 1943. Back in his office that evening, Ritter cross-referenced the tail marking against Allied records available through public archives. The 381st Bombardment Group had used the LG designation. Within that group's records, he found the mission report for October 14, 1943. 5 aircraft lost. 1 crew partially recovered. Pilot, First Lieutenant Robert W. McCoy. After 44 years, the last sighting had been found, frozen in silver nitrate and German precision. Summer came to the Hünfeld forest with the particular green intensity of German woodlands, beech and oak forming a canopy that filtered sunlight into cathedral dimness. Ritter returned with 2 assistants, carrying metal detectors, surveying equipment, and permission from the local forestry office. They worked from the coordinates in the Luftwaffe report, triangulating with landmarks that appeared in the 1943 photographs and still existed: a stone boundary marker, a creek that had not changed course, the line of an old road. The impact site, if anything remained, would be within a defined search area. Liesl Koenig, Ritter's graduate student, swept the metal detector in careful arcs while Ritter photographed the terrain, attempting to match it to the wartime images. The forest had reclaimed the crash site thoroughly. 44 years of growth had softened every scar. On the 3rd day, the metal detector's tone changed. Koenig marked the spot and began digging carefully with a trowel. 20 centimeters down, she uncovered twisted aluminium, oxidized green-grey but still recognizable as part of an aircraft structure. They excavated methodically, photographing each layer, cataloguing each fragment. Most pieces were small, shattered by impact and scattered by weather, but in one corner of the site they found something larger, a section of oxygen equipment. Its cylindrical tank bent but intact enough to retain markings. Ritter cleaned the surface carefully with a soft brush. Stamped into the metal was a serial number, 4231267OH8. The prefix matched the serial fragment found in Hoffman's Field in 1958. The OH designation indicated Ohio manufacturing. The complete number could be traced to a specific aircraft. "We have it," Koenig said quietly. Ritter nodded. They continued excavating through the afternoon, finding smaller pieces, fragments of instruments, bits of wiring, pieces of structure too damaged to identify specifically but clearly from a B-17. By evening they had documented the site completely. That night, in his hotel room, Ritter began preparing his report. He laid out the evidence in chronological order: the Luftwaffe photographs, the coordinates, the physical wreckage, the oxygen tank serial number. Each piece alone was suggestive. Together they formed a conclusion. The Fulda Historical Society met in a room above the public library. 15 members gathered on a Thursday evening to hear Ritter present his findings. He had prepared a careful presentation: slides showing the archival photographs, maps plotting the crash site, tables correlating the evidence. He began with the mission itself, describing the second Schweinfurt raid, its objectives, its casualties. Then he narrowed focus to a single aircraft, a single crew, a single pilot who had stayed with his plane so his men could jump. The audience listened with the particular attention of people hearing their own history reclaimed. Several were old enough to remember the war, the distant sounds of aircraft, the explosions that had sometimes rattled windows. When Ritter showed the photographs of the tail section with the LGN marking, an elderly man in the front row raised his hand. "I remember," he said in German. His name was Ernst Weber, and he had been 14 in 1943. "My father was part of the patrol that found the wreck. He came home and told us an American pilot had stayed with his plane until impact. He said it was either bravery or the controls were jammed. Maybe both." Others confirmed fragments of memory: the smoke visible from the village, the burial several days later in Heinrichsruh, the wooden cross that had stood for years before weathering required its replacement, and the plane. "Could the grave be exhumed?" someone asked. "To confirm the identification?" Ritter shook his head. "That decision rests with the American and German governments. My role is to present the evidence, not to advocate for specific action." But privately, he doubted exhumation would occur. Too much time had passed. Too much trauma had been inflicted on remains that had burned. Dental records from 1943 were incomplete. DNA analysis not yet routine for such cases. The bureaucratic barriers were immense. After the presentation, people approached with their own stories, their own memories of the war. Ritter listened to each, taking notes. History was not just documents, he understood, but the accumulation of individual memories, each one fragmentary yet essential. By evening's end, the case had become communal knowledge, no longer locked in archives, but returned to the landscape where it had occurred. The American embassy in Bonn occupied a modern building that contrasted sharply with the war-damaged architecture still visible in parts of the city. In January 1988, Ritter arrived carrying a leather portfolio containing his complete dossier on the McCoy case. He met with Charles Brennan, the deputy chief of mission, and Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the military attaché. They received him with professional courtesy, offering coffee before settling at a conference table to review his findings. Ritter presented the evidence systematically, the archival photographs showing the tail marking, the crash site coordinates from Luftwaffe records, the physical evidence recovered from the Hünfeld forest, including the oxygen tank with its complete serial number, the burial record from Heinrichsruh, the testimony from villagers, the ICRC documentation from 1974. He had prepared a written summary, 30 pages with appendices, cross-referenced and footnoted according to academic standards. Each claim was sourced, each connection documented. The circumstantial case is compelling, Brennan acknowledged, after reviewing the materials. But you understand our constraints. Without physical identification, we cannot officially change Lieutenant McCoy's status from missing to killed in action. I understand, Ritter said. I do not ask for official action. I ask only that the evidence be placed in his file, that it be available to historians, to his family if any survive, to anyone seeking to understand what occurred. Colonel Mitchell made notes as she examined the photographs. This is thorough work, Dr. Ritter. The oxygen tank's serial number is particularly significant. We can verify that against manufacturing records. I have already done so, Ritter said, producing another document. Tank number 08 was installed in aircraft 42 T-31,267, which was assigned to the 380 Search Bombardment Group in August 1943. The aircraft designation was LGN. The pilot on October 14, 1943, was First Lieutenant Robert W. McCoy. Brennan and Mitchell exchanged glances. We'll forward this to Washington, Brennan said, to the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency. They'll make the determination about what, if any, action to take. Ritter thanked them and departed, leaving his dossier behind. In the embassy afterward, Mitchell prepared a cable to Washington. Request priority review of McCoy case. New evidence strongly supports probable location of remains. The cable from Bonn arrived at the Pentagon on a Friday afternoon, routed to the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency, in a building that had once processed casualty reports from Vietnam. Major David Chen, assigned to European theatre cases, read through Ritter's dossier with mounting interest. He pulled the McCoy file, now thick with decades of accumulated documentation. The original mission report from 1943, Harper's POW testimony, the 1958 wreckage discovery, the 1974 ICRC findings. Each piece had been filed separately, examined individually, but never synthesized into a comprehensive analysis. Chen created a timeline, plotting each piece of evidence chronologically. The pattern was clear. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. McCoy had crashed near Hünfeld on October 14, 1943. His crew had survived, he had not. His body had been buried in Heinrichsruh. The grave remained. He cross-referenced the oxygen tank serial number against Air Force historical records. The match was exact. Aircraft 42-31,267 had been delivered to the 380 Surf in August 1943, assigned the marking LGN, and lost on the Schweinfurt mission. Chen prepared his analysis carefully, aware that after 45 years, this might be the final chapter. His conclusion was measured. Based on the totality of evidence, including documentary, testimonial, and physical findings, there is high probability that First Lieutenant Robert W. McCoy died on October 14, 1943, in the crash of his aircraft near Hünfeld, Germany, and that his remains were interred in Heinrichsruh Cemetery. But he added a critical caveat: without physical remains available for identification, and without living family members requesting exhumation, this case cannot be definitively closed. Recommends status remain, missing in action, with notation of probable location of loss. The recommendation reflected bureaucratic reality. Exhumation would require German government approval, significant resources, and no guarantee of successful identification. With 45 years elapsed, with the family reduced to distant relatives, if any survived, the cost-benefit calculation did not favour action. The report was reviewed, approved, and forwarded to the file. McCoy's status would remain unchanged, but the evidence would be recorded, preserved for future reference. A answer incomplete, yet better than silence. The reunion at Ridgewell Airfield in 1989 was smaller than previous gatherings, time having winnowed the survivors. The base itself had long since been decommissioned, its runways broken by weather, buildings repurposed or demolished. But the memorial remained, a stone marker listing the names of those who had not returned. Thomas Harper attended, now 74, walking with a cane. Ritter had contacted him months earlier, sharing his findings. Harper had received the information with quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes not from triumph, but from completion. A journalist from the Eastern Daily Press attended, having heard about Ritter's research. She interviewed the survivors, asking about McCoy, about that mission, about what it meant to finally have answers. "We always knew in our hearts," Harper said. "But knowing in your heart and having it documented are different things. The documentation means he won't be forgotten. It means someone cared enough to look, to search, to remember." The journalist asked if he felt closure. Harper considered the question. "Don't think there's closure for something like this. The war doesn't close. It just becomes history. But at least now the history is more complete." The story ran in the newspaper several days later under the headline, "The Pilot Who Stayed. New Evidence in 46-Year-Old Mystery." It summarized Ritter's findings, quoted Harper's testimony, described the oxygen tank and the grave in Heinrichsruh. Other newspapers picked up the story. It appeared in aviation magazines, in military history journals, in local papers in Ohio, where McCoy's family had lived. The story spread, not because it was sensational, but because it resonated. A quiet act of heroism finally acknowledged. A mystery not fully solved, but at least illuminated. At the reunion, the survivors raised a glass in the traditional toast, but this year Harper added words. "To Lieutenant McCoy, to the pilot who stayed, we made it home because you didn't." The words hung in the evening air, acknowledgement and gratitude rendered in the simple language of those who had been there, who understood what those final moments had cost. The memorial stone arrived in Heinrichsruh on a grey morning in March 1990, transported from a mason in Frankfurt. It was granite, dark and durable, engraved with careful precision. The village council had approved the replacement of the weathered wooden cross, and funding had come through quiet channels from the American embassy. Father Schwartz, now retired but still living in the parish, attended the dedication ceremony. Ritter was there, as was Liesl Koenig. A representative from the American embassy stood with Colonel Mitchell, who had travelled from Bonn. Several villagers gathered, some remembering the war, others simply respecting the moment. The stone was set in place, its inscription both simple and complete, in memory of an American airman believed to be one still. Robert W. McCoy, United States Army, Army Forces, died October 14, 1943. He stayed so others could live. The American representative read a brief statement, acknowledging the evidence, thanking the German authorities and historians for their diligence, noting that while official identification remained incomplete, the moral certainty was sufficient for remembrance. Father Schwartz offered a prayer, speaking in both German and English, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. He spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the dignity owed to all who had fallen, regardless of uniform. Afterward, people approached the stone, some placing flowers, others simply standing in silence. Ritter remained longer than the rest, studying the inscription, satisfied that his work had led to this moment. Not official closure, but acknowledged memory. The ceremony was brief, unsentimental, appropriate to the man it honoured. No speeches about heroism, no dramatic declarations, simply recognition that a life had ended here, that duty had been fulfilled, that memory persisted despite time's erosion. As the gathering dispersed, Koenig asked Ritter if he felt the case was truly closed. "No case like this truly closes," he replied. "But at least now, when someone stands here, they know who lies beneath. That's something. Perhaps that's enough." The stone stood where the wooden cross had stood, solid and permanent, a marker not just of death, but of remembrance earned. The tablets of the missing at Cambridge American Cemetery catch the morning light differently, depending on the season, the carved names emerging from shadow or receding into it according to the sun's geometry. On an October morning, in the years following the dedication at Heinrichsruh, a visitor might stand before the wall and find the name McCoy among the thousands inscribed there. The name remains officially unchanged. The Department of Defense never reclassified his status from missing in action to killed in action. The evidentiary threshold, that final step requiring physical identification, was never crossed. In bureaucratic terms, Robert W. McCoy is still missing, still absent, still somewhere in the uncertain space between known and unknown. Yet those who seek his story now find more than absence. They find mission reports describing the Schweinfurt raid's terrible arithmetic. They find Harper's testimony about a pilot who held the controls so his crew could jump. They find Ritter's dossier with its photographs and serial numbers and patient accumulation of evidence. They find the burial record from Heinrichsruh, the stone bearing his name, the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes knowing where matters almost as much as knowing for certain. The story became part of the institutional memory of those who study the air war. A case cited in discussions of MIA recovery, an example of how truth emerges through layers of time and documentation, not dramatic, not conclusive, but real in the way history is real, fragments assembled, silences interpreted, memory preserved against forgetting's gravity. Mrs. McCoy did not live to see the memorial stone placed. She died in 1982, 7 years before Ritter found the photographs in Kassel. Her letters remained in the file, testimony to persistence, each one a small act of defiance against erasure. On the tablets at Cambridge, McCoy's name stands among others who also vanished into war's confusion. The stone records what was lost, but elsewhere, in archives, in memorials, in the memories of those who searched, another record exists of what was found. Not a body, perhaps, but a story. Not certainty, but something close enough to let history breathe again